Welcome back to the next episode of the roster recap series. We're going to take a look at the teams in the AFC North, sort of who they drafted, where their rosters sit, and sort of where we predict them sort of moving forward this season. So first what we're going to do is talk about the Steelers. So some of the needs I see is a wide receiver 2. They need a left tackle, a right guard, right tackle, and a CB2. So it's a lot of on the offensive line with the Steelers. So in the draft, they in their first round, pick number 20, they got Troy Fautanu out of Washington. He has a lot of upside, and he's going to probably be a dominant tackle, but he has shorter arms and may need to transition to guard if he needs to, get away from sort of the elite pass rushers. They sort of have both needs, so whether he fits in as a tackle or as a guard, there's really sort of no downside to either one because honestly they need upgrades at both positions. In the second round, pick number 51, they took Zach Frazier out of West Virginia. He's predicted to be a day one starter at center. He's a really good run blocker. Not necessarily the most talented in the world, but he's really technically sound. Could be better as a guard if he struggles to sort of be able to move off double teams and get to the second level. But either way, a very solid pick for them. That definitely could be sort of a consistent starter for at least for a little while as he sort of grows and develops a little more. With the next pick, pick number 84 was Roman Wilson out of Michigan. So he's sort of projects to be an excellent slot receiver. He can really stretch the field and go on the outside in certain circumstances and situations. He is a little limited in terms of his versatility there. Part of the reason why he was available in the third round. So, I definitely see him contributing as a rookie and then probably growing from there. If he can really develop his route running, he might have some versatility on the outside also. Then also in the third round, pick 97, they grabbed Peyton Wilson. So he has a lot of upside. He has a little bit of where he's a little too aggressive and over pursues and gets out of position. So he's really going to need to work on sort of eye discipline and sort of breaking down, in the NFL. I think one benefit of some of these players is, the NFL is just so much of a different game in terms of, talent, and sort of scheme and a lot of different things like that. And so I think it kind of just forces you to learn to kind of, respect other people's athleticism. I think in college you can kind of get away with it a little more because sometimes you may be one of the most athletic people on the field, depending on sort of where you play. Definitely at NC State, I bet for a lot of their matchups, he probably was one of the more dominant players. So that might be why he was maybe a little more aggressive. Then in the fourth round, pick 119, they drafted a guard, Mason McCormick. So he's sort of a traitsy kind of guard, but he really needs to work on his technique. So I think this is a perfect place to grab like a developmental player. And if he's really able to grow, he's going to be a really great. I mean, he might have more upside than Frazier, but I think Frazier is sort of a plug and play first day starter. But because they grabbed two guards, I don't see both of them necessarily starting, but I think McCormick really can develop, and maybe he might even take over later in the year, sort of as the sort of he works on some of his technique issues. In the sixth round, they grabbed pick 178. They grabbed Logan Lee, who is an interior defensive lineman from Iowa. He's sort of a smaller defensive tackle and he really needs to sort of develop his pass rush moves to be a situational pass rusher. He could bulk up to be a nose. He's a 6'5", his good height to clog up the middle. It would be a complete change, like body type. We've seen sort of around the league, some players kind of take their time to sort of change from, like in this case, it'd be like a 3-tech to a 1-tech. Be more of a run stuffer versus a sort of quick and agile sort of guy. But if he does sort of struggle to develop some of those pass rusher moves, maybe during training camp or even maybe during his rookie year, I could definitely see maybe a transition to that because I do sort of like the frame a lot. He's more of a leaner kind of defensive tackle. So also in the sixth round, actually was their last pick. They didn't have a seventh rounder this year. Pick 195, they grabbed cornerback Ryan Watts. So he's really just needs to develop technique. He's sort of a better zone corner. So definitely a developmental pick, like most sixth round picks are going to be. but there is the potential to maybe develop there. The CB2 position is kind of wide open, so if for somehow he's able to sort of beat out some of the veteran corners, there is the potential to start. If he does start, that's actually not a great sign for the Steelers in terms of their back end of their defense. And obviously you have T.J. Watt, you have I think it's Highsmith if I remember right on the D line. They've sort of invested a little bit with some other defensive players. I think it's always their back four. Their front seven is usually pretty good. So some of my thoughts on this draft class. They obviously needed to retool the offensive line. Bringing in Wilson and Russell Wilson and Justin Fields means that they aren't really hitting the reset button with a rookie QB like they could have. But in the end, if they can't protect either of them, it's not going to work well. I think if the offensive line is a little rough during training camp, and I haven't paid attention too much to Steelers minicamp, although offensive line I kind of don't really pay attention or care too much about before they get pads on because it's such a physical position. But if the offensive line is a little on the weaker side, I could see Fields maybe being a better because he's just a lot more movable. You can do some QB runs, give them some advantageous positions in terms of having that extra blocker. And obviously Fields is a lot younger. I think back in the day, Russell Wilson, perfect person to be in this type of situation. But with sort of where they are, some quarterback wise, I think Fields might be the better starter, unless if the offensive line really gels well during training camp, and then maybe you want to go with Russell Wilson just for the sort of veteran presence. Although last year he kind of really struggled and sort of made some kind of silly mistakes, so they'll have to see how sort of that goes this summer. Roman Wilson was an interesting pick for them. They really need weapons on their offense. He does have limited size, so it could be a liability in the run game, but he's generally probably going to be mostly a slot. So obviously you can run out of the slot some, but that's obviously not going to be your bread and butter type of play calls. So I think he'll probably do pretty well there. They got some interesting players, sort of, Browns 4 and on. They do have some potentials to be good players, but they need considerable development, and probably only going to contribute sort of in special teams as rookies unless if there's an injury. So there is some signs that maybe the Steelers sort of recognize a little bit like where they're at in terms of as a team, how competitive they can be in the AFC. I will be interested to see if they do sort of start off pretty poorly this year with the reset in the roster a little bit. If there's going to come a time when they're going to have to decide, do they stick with TJ Watt or do they trade? Because if they're not going to be super competitive, you're not going to win the Super Bowl. It's sort of like hanging on. Like he's been there for a really long time and he's worked his tail off, but he really hasn't been able to see much playoff success. So there is going to come a time when it's like, why are you holding on to such a good player when you could get some assets? I would think probably at least a first round pick for him. He's still, I think, 29. He's going to turn 30 this year. So the longer they wait to make a move like that, they obviously could just keep him. But I do think essentially trading cap space for a draft pick and kind of dumping like probably maybe, I don't know if he's still a top 5 because he's had some injuries, but he's definitely probably a top 7, top 8 pass rusher and just like defensive weapon on the line. So I think they're kind of in this weird place where they kind of need to decide. I do think they've been doing this, and everyone sort of always pays attention to the the Tomlin stat of never a losing record. And even if they get rid of T.J. Watt, to be honest, he's been injured, and he is a difference maker, but he can't make up for some of the limitations in the roster. So there is a sort of a question of what impact record wise might it have. Obviously, if they do make the playoffs, obviously you want someone like that on the field, but they may have a hard time even just getting there. I know last year they kind of backed into the playoffs. I think it was up until the last game. I think they needed certain teams to lose, and it wasn't like you win and you're in, I believe, if I remember right, with the Steelers. So I do think that there's some reasons to maybe trade him away. So next I'm going to go into the Ravens. So looking at the roster, the Ravens they kind of still needed wide receiver 2, a slot receiver. right tackle, a defensive end. They do have Kyle Van Noy as a right outside linebacker, and he played pretty well last year. Obviously, there's always the chance that he sort of falls off, but at the very least, you sort of need someone in waiting to take over when there is going to come a time when Kyle Van Noy either isn't really starting caliber, or he decides retire too. So it's a possibility. But then they also have cornerback as a significant need. So in the first round, they grabbed Nate Wiggins, 30th overall. He's a cornerback out of Clemson. I think he's going to be an immediate day one starter. He's sort of the off the ball corner. In the second round, they grabbed Rosengarten, who's an offensive tackle out of Washington. He's a better run blocker. He's pretty mobile, can get to the outside on pulls and traps, but he needs to strengthen up a little bit to hold against the run in the pass. I think he's going to be an immediate starter at right tackle. So next in the third round, they've got, I think it's Adisa Isaac, who's an edge out of Penn State. He needs to develop some technique, and he can be used in some pass rush situations and sort of develop into an every down player. I think he does have some decent upside, especially grabbing someone like in the third round who may not contribute a ton aside from in pass rush situations, or if there's an injury sort of in the rotation. That's sort of a great kind of, in the third round, that's sort of a great place to sort of take a flyer on somebody like that. In the fourth round, they grabbed Devontae Walker, so it's a wide receiver out of North Carolina. He has the speed to sort of both be in the slot and on the outside. He's a versatile player with sort of big play potential, but he really needs to develop sort of his wide receiver, technical skills. So he is good. I think he definitely has some potential, but he's not necessarily a plug and play wide receiver too, or something like that. I think he's really going to be more in the slot. Maybe kind of move around a little bit, or maybe you move Zay Flowers around a little bit, because I know he has a lot of versatility. So I think that's definitely sort of a possibility. That's probably where I would go personally. Sort of have Flowers going to be like your matchup receiver, and then maybe put the Walker on the outside. But I guess we'll kind of see training camp and preseason sort of where that looks. In the fourth round, pick 130, they grabbed TJ Tampa as a cornerback. He's also another good zone corner. He kind of needs to develop a little bit with his man-to-man technique. He has like the physical traits, but he has to work out his fluidity. And really, when you see Tampa and Nate Wiggins, I think it's a sign that the Ravens are going to continue to run a pretty zone-heavy scheme. So in the fifth round here, we got Rasheen Ali. He's a running back out of Marshall. He's a smaller back who's had some fumbling issues. He may never be a true three-down back, just because of his sort of limitations with pass blocking. But he could definitely be a role player if he can work on some of his fundamentals. He definitely has some skills and traits that you sort of like. In the sixth round, we got Devin Leary. He's a quarterback out of Kentucky. He's just going to be your sort of backup quarterback, practice squad emergency quarterback. I guess we'll sort of see in training camp sort of how well he does. I'm interested to see some of the preseason games. I don't know if he's going to just be the straight up backup quarterback. I think at this point, the Ravens have kind of gotten lucky a little bit with Huntley in terms of, Lamar going down. It's kind of hard to rely on a rookie quarterback. It's easy to say, well, if you lose Lamar, the season's over. But we kind of see from Huntley that's not necessarily true. So I don't necessarily see Leary as like a Huntley type, because I think they're completely different types of quarterbacks from what I'm aware of. So I think a lot of it will just depend on how quick he picks up the offense and stuff like that. But obviously, he's not going to be challenging Lamar for starting. Obviously, I think he'll be, if they go into the season with him as the backup, and then maybe carry a veteran QB on the practice squad. I think that goes a long way of showing you that he is a quality player. So then in the seventh round, we've got Nick Samak, who's a center out of Michigan State. He's a strong player who really needs to just develop his technique to be effective in the NFL. I think we've seen a little bit so far this year. Some of our other reviews I've done AFC East and NFC East so far, and then obviously this one. We've seen some teams take some flyers on some pretty kind of talented but raw players in terms of their technique. So he's another player like that who, if he does develop, I think he could be a quality starter, and maybe even a 10-year starter kind of player. But that's a big if, right? He's been playing football potentially for a long time now. You've been working on these techniques. There's the potential that once you get, and that's your job, your whole frame of reference is so much different. And then obviously the quality of the coaching is going to be different also. But yeah, I mean, he's a 7th round draft pick for a reason. And then the last pick here, we've got pick number 250. We've got Sanusi Kane. So this is a safety out of Purdue. He also sort of has some limitations. He gets kind of lost sometimes in deep field coverages, but he's be really good as a matchup against a tight end or providing run support. It could be one of those things where you have him in there as like maybe a third safety or like a nickelback, or a dime linebacker, where it's sort of like maybe you're going up against the Chiefs, and so you have zones back, but then you have a player like this matching up against Kelsey or something like that at a 1-to-1, just like lock that down, make them go somewhere else, have zones behind it for if he does try to do a double move, something like that. That might be sort of the thought process there, but again, another 7th round pick, so pretty much a developmental piece. So when we kind of look at this draft class in general, I think it is sort of doubling down a little bit on sort of the deep cover 2 shell defenses that we've seen, go against some of the top tier quarterbacks like Mahomes, Allen, Burrow, and then obviously Jackson too. And it's kind of recognizing that it's harder and harder to get top tier man corners, and usually when they are, they're drafted pretty high because it's a highly sought after skill. So I think you're going to see more and more teams sort of loading up on zone corners. And obviously you'll always be working on man, because man is very useful in certain situations, but not something you can rely on, nowadays, because it's no longer they have one good quarterback, right? Because it was like, and maybe this is just me and sort of my football knowledge, but I always say, like, who played on the opposite side of Jerry Rice? Who played on the opposite side of Terrell Owens? Who played on the other side with Randy Moss? You don't really see that as much anymore. You see, teams are really loading up on wide receivers. People are wanting to play wide receiver because it obviously it's just more lucrative and more fun when you're younger to be scoring and stuff like that. So teams, it's not enough to have one good receiver. It's not even enough to have two. You really almost need 3 like dominant wide receivers. And you think of like the Dolphins, right? You have Tyreek Hill, you have Jalen Waddle, and you have OBJ, right? 3 quality receivers. Obviously, really good in Tyreek, very good in Waddle, and then OBJ at this point in his career is a very quality wide receiver. So you kind of see that. I think that is one of the reasons why a lot of these teams are sort of tripling up on zone corners, because you kind of can never have enough of them. In terms of Isaac, Walker, and Samak, I think that those are going to be a lot of developmental players. They're going to really need to refine their games and try to minimize their deficits and maybe become starters over time. I think they're kind of signaling a little bit that they kind of have their players in now, that they're pretty good. They're defenders, they're starters on defense, and that they really want to sort of plan for the future. So in 3 to 4 years, obviously they're still going to have Hamilton. I think Roquan Smith might be sort of effective, but at the end of his career, some of the other players, but they really need to sort of plan ahead for what they're going to do when some of these players start to fall off, or they can't afford them anymore. Things like that. So their Ravens are in that we're paying Lamar, so we kind of have to watch out what we do everywhere else kind of mode. So I think that's also why you're seeing them invest in some developmental players who maybe, if they invest in those players, they do become well when they're signing their next deal. Maybe they get more team friendly. You've seen that around the league a little bit, where some teams that really invest in some people who don't necessarily have the draft stock that some of the other players have, it kind of really makes a huge difference. I would probably give like a B+ to this one. It's like a combo of sort of first day starters, day one contributors, and developmental players. I think it is like the perfect, like, here and now. Here's a player who can potentially be a star. Some good like starters, who are definitely very talented, and then some players who they really need to develop a lot to be able to rationalize keeping them on the roster. And in the end, they may become more practice squad players, but unless if other teams really valued them a lot higher than they got drafted, which I doubt, they're probably going to be at a B+ be able to stay on the practice squad. So I like this draft a lot. I think where they're picking, especially, very good. They're always have an eye on the let's win a Super Bowl, while also sort of planning for the future. I really like the way the Ravens run. I mean, they've been well run ever since I've really been following football more than just like watch the game that's on TV on the weekend. Ever since I've kind of really started to get into it and started playing it in high school and stuff, I've really been a fan of sort of how the Ravens front office sort of manages their team and stuff like that. Next, we're going to go into the Bengals. So, looking at the Bengals, I see some of their needs is slot wide receiver, obviously refilling that, left guard, tight end, running back, and then defensive tackle and some cornerback. So in the first round, they got Amarius Mims out of Georgia. I can see him as a competition or replacement for Trent Brown at the right tackle. He could just be a quality backup or maybe a six offensive lineman in jumbo sets or in goal line packages. Mims, that is. Or it could say, Trent Brown, you're going to sort of be the backup. They're older, probably more having the stamina and durability for a 17-game season is really tough, especially on the offensive line where you're like it's play in play out. You get very few rest. So maybe on a backup role might be more suitable, but a lot of it depends on how Mims does this training camp. He may not be ready. It's rookie offensive tackles. It can be a little rough. And do you want Joe Burrow maybe having a kind of like a turnstile on your right side? That was at the beginning of the year. Probably not. So I really do see Trent Brown starting, but I do think that Mims is going to push a lot, and he may get on the field even if he's not a starter right away. Next, in the second round, they got defensive tackle Chris Jenkins out of Michigan. He's a really good run stuffing defensive tackle, a good sort of complement to B.J. Hill, who's a little more of that sort of agile pass rusher, kind of disruptor type. If he can sort of require more double teams, it might also allow their linebackers to play more aggressive and sort of blitz more, sort of try to really blow up those running plays, play a little more free. So I think he could go a long way into doing that. Obviously, he has to earn that disruption. You're not going to just double team someone because they're a big defensive tackle. They have to show that without doing that, they're going to really be disruptive. So we'll kind of see how that goes. But if he hits, I think it's going to make a huge difference for that. In the third round, they grabbed Jermaine Burton out of Alabama. He's like a well-rounded wide receiver with some experience on the inside and the outside, although he's mostly on the outside at Alabama. He kind of struggles in his release against press coverage and has committed a lot of kind of personal fouls with some consistency. And the NFL is just so cued into that right now. I think that's unfortunately a big issue. So, Burton's not really tall. He's not really necessarily fast, but he's really versatile. And he could really, be in the slot this year, maybe transition to wide receiver 2 if they don't keep Higgins long term, or he could stay in the slot. And the Bengals could either re-sign Higgins, get a free agent, or draft someone next year. The versatility is really great. Obviously, they'd love for him to just develop and become that sort of next Tee Higgins type. I'm not sure how realistic that is. Obviously, that's best case scenario for the Bengals. But I think at the very least, it gives them options next year. So, keep him in the slot. He's a good slot. Replace that position with someone else, or maybe just go ahead and pay Tee Higgins and figure out the rest of it some other way. But the versatility, I think, is going to go a long way, both in this year, just sort of keeping the team together, and then I think moving forward, you can having more than one option. If you have one option, you start reaching, you start overpaying people in free agency, all this kind of stuff. So I think the versatility is going to go a long way. Next, we have McKinley Jackson, who's a defensive tackle and with Texas A&M. He's a 3-tech that needs to develop some of his pass rush moves. He's limited by shorter sort of arm length, but I could definitely see him as being a solid starter. He's probably going to be the backup for B.J. Hill, sort of work on those pass rush moves, and maybe develop into a future starter if B.J. Hill isn't re-signed this year. He's actually on an expiring contract that is up in 2024. I do see. I would probably say re-sign him maybe another 2 years, keep him till he's like 31, 32. Forget exactly when his birthday is in terms of the league calendar, but that's probably where I would go. So, you have McKinley, Jackson. Maybe you can keep BJ Hill and rotate. Even if he doesn't have the stamina to be playing like every down. I think that's sort of what they're looking for. But at the very least, you have sort of someone who can kind of come in, give him a little bit of rest, and then maybe address it in the future years if he's not really developing this summer and during the season the way he needs to. So then in the fourth round, so actually pick 115, we have Eric All out of Iowa. He's tight end. So he's a really solid and versatile tight end who needs to sort of develop in running routes against zone and sort of polish up a little bit of his run blocking. He's going to always be a limited player because of his speed, which isn't as detrimental for tight ends as it is for some of the other positions, but you're not going to become a top 10 tight end by running like a pretty slow 40, like a 4.8, 4.9. I'm not exactly sure where his 40 time is, but it's definitely not on the faster end. So because of his versatility, he could be an every down tight end. It's really all about learning how to run against zone coverages because he's probably considering the fact that you have, Jamar Chase, you have Higgins, you have some of these other players. You're not going to be obviously building your defense around stopping Eric All, right? So definitely some work to do. They do run 11 personnel 67% of the time on first down. In those, he'll probably always be like the fourth option in most pass situations, especially considering sort of a little bit of turnover with their running backs. So I could definitely see where he might have some success. He might be able to eat because people, like I said, are focusing in on some of the other targets, at least this year. What happens with wide receiver 2 with the Bengals is going to be really interesting. If he can develop and become like that second option, become a really savvy route runner, strong sort of contested catch type player, then, that might even free up some of the conversations around what to do with Tee Higgins. But I just don't see that kind of production coming from him. I think he lasted to the fourth round for a reason. I don't really see, him being able to sort of match up well against your sort of your the teams with really good defense against tight ends or good schemes that sort of match up well against sort of the slower, less athletic tight ends. So I don't necessarily see that. I think it's more of a stopgap. Like let's have him here. Maybe he might even start. Maybe he won't, but at least have him be able to sort of rotate in this year while we have still our core together, and then maybe transition him to tight end 2 next year. Draft either keep Higgins or draft a tight end or sign someone who's a great outside threat. I think that's something that might happen. So in the fifth round, we've got Josh Newton out of TCU. So he's a versatile corner who's really has a lot of football savvy, definitely high football IQ. He can really be effective in zone and man. He just doesn't have great straight line speed, so he's not necessarily probably going to be able to be a bump and run corner, like bump and run, single high, on the outside. No, not much help over the top. He's probably just going to get burned, right? So that's probably not his. That's probably just not his skill set. But I think he does match up well. Knows how to hand off, people in zones. Knows how to sort of move with receivers when they're able to. Does have the physicality to sort of go up, kind of knock balls out, be sort of firm, in the sort of in those windows, stuff like that. Come up, make tackles, that sort of thing. But just unfortunately, I think the reality is if he ran a 4.3, he might be a top 15, top 20 pick. I mean, I think that's just the reality of a lot of these players. They're technically sound, and they just don't have the speed. You need speed, especially at corner in the NFL. There's just so many good speedy wide receivers. So at pick 194, we've got Tanner McLaughlin out of Arizona. He's not a physical blocker. Eric All is definitely a better, sort of run blocker, at least right now. But he can seal off defenders and has good instincts when running against zones. So he's a little better of a sort of route runner, receiving threat. He can get fast once he has time to build up speed, but it kind of takes him a little bit to get there. So in terms of running against maybe zones, maybe more seams as opposed to more crossers, but definitely not going to be a tight end, sort of a high end tight end 1. But I think he definitely could develop into more sort of solid tight end 2, or even just a more middle of the road sort of starting tight end. And definitely good sort of replacement value if, in case of an injury, stuff like that. So I think he'll probably, as a prospect, obviously they picked all before they picked Tanner. So I think it's a little bit showing you kind of like what they value. So, they kind of want that all around tight end, maybe more of a blocker, not necessarily as much of a receiving threat. Not that they don't want a receiving threat, but they're not just grabbing maulers, basically like lean offensive linemen at that point. But they do maybe value sort of an all around skill set as opposed to someone who's going to be good in going out in patterns. So in the 6th round, pick 214, they grabbed Cedric Johnson out of Ole Miss. This is a versatile player who's sort of boom and bust type on run defense and pass rushing. He sort of needs to develop some consistency and technique to be effective in the NFL. This is like a perfect late round type player. He's a good development player. He's not going to contribute much as a rookie, but if he can kind of work on some of that consistency, I mean, I'm not saying he's going to be a Pro Bowler every year, but he could pop off from time to time. Could be a very quality player. So next we had pick 224 in the 7th round. We got Dijon Anthony out of Ole Miss. He's a really good safety in press coverage. He's sort of a willing tackler. He doesn't have great fluidity and kind of like to be able to play like tightly in coverage, and he relies a little too much on cushion. But if you converted him to more of a deep safety, he's obviously not going to need to, be tight in coverage as much to kind of hide that deficit a little bit. So I definitely could definitely see some potential there, especially running some 3 safety kind of deeper coverages in certain situations, some stuff like that. I think he's just going to need to learn how to be a deep safety in the NFL. You really can't be getting caught. Okay, so next we have Matt Lee. He's a center out of Miami. He's a decent pass blocker. He's got solid technique, but he just doesn't have like the physicality that you want, and he's susceptible to the bull rush. He's really going to need to be able to polish his technique to reach his ceiling. Most likely just a depth piece. I'm not exactly sure, sort of age-wise, where he is, but if he's a younger player, it is possible that he might be able to increase his physicality, become a good player. But I think more likely it's going to be depth piece, and I think if you are starting him, you're really going to have to lean on double teams with him. So providing double teams, sort of sliding out, helping someone else, chipping, somewhere, maybe even pulling to the outside, kind of getting him against linebackers and corners and stuff like that. So I don't really see a ton of upside, but last pick of the draft, 7th round, that's pretty pretty good if he's able to stick on the team. That's sort of what you're looking for. So overall, the Bengals sort of got a lot of their needs met in the draft. They doubled up on a few positions, tight end and defensive tackle. So they may not be 100% certain on like the first one they drafted will be able to start right away, and they kind of want extra competition. I didn't really see any major reaches. There might have been some other players maybe at the time, if you went pick by pick, that you might have sort of valued higher from an outside perspective, but it does seem like they are valuing versatility rather than drafting one to excel in one specific area. Could signal kind of wanting a little more scheme versatility, not wanting to kind of tip their hand of what they're doing based on the personnel that's out there. And they might be sort of prepping for less cap when, Burrow's contract kicks in, and more than likely they're going to lose Tee Higgins. So, there's a lot of players who need development. They don't necessarily have a ton of, upside in terms of measurables and athleticism. They may want to have more, sort of role players, people who come in, they can do a lot of different things, but not necessarily a down in, down out type player. Really, the only one that I saw that sort of, had the higher scores and, has the higher potential is probably Cedric Johnson, who needs to develop quite a bit to be able to get there. They may want to get more sort of NFL ready backups in the later rounds in most positions, but I think with a roster like the Bengals, they kind of have that luxury of, honestly, could they just run it back, not even have any draft picks, just run it back as it was? I think it would be a pretty solid team. I mean, maybe not the best roster in the league, but even without the draft this year, I think they're still going to be pretty competitive, assuming Burrow stays healthy this year. So definitely sort of in that B range. I think I probably would have gone for maybe a little more boomer and bust type players. later in the draft. I think that there were some still around. The two tight ends that are kind of similar, but have a little difference. I don't know about that, so that's the main reason why I'm kind of staying away from like a B plus A minus range. So I would just give it just a solid B. So the last team here is the Browns. Just looking over the roster, I see the needs being wide receiver, some defensive tackle depth, and maybe even a future starter, linebacker depth, and then corner. Part of me wants to put quarterback here, but considering you give up 3 firsts and all that money, you kind of can't really be drafting a quarterback. So they don't really have a lot of needs sort of on paper, but I honestly I have the Deshaun Watson trade is not turning out the way I think the Browns were hoping. So it's kind of a need. It's kind of a sneaky need. I don't know if Flacco's going to go back there or not, but I do think that they have an issue with quarterback. But I think regardless of what happens, you're gonna have to ride or die with it, even if it's not super great. So look at their draft. Obviously, they didn't have a first round pick because of that trade that we were just talking about. But in the second round, pick 54, they grabbed Michael Hall Jr., who's a defensive tackle at Ohio State. He's a smaller DT. He's sort of quick, and he's got sort of upside as a pass rusher, but he needs to sort of stay strong against double teams and against the run. He's better at moving laterally against the run than holding up rush lanes in the middle. Then he's had some recent injuries. So they have kind of their run stuffing interior defensive tackle and kind of learn to rotate with Shelby Harris to run as the 3 tech. So he's going to benefit from being on the same line as Garrett. So he's not going to really see a ton of those double teams because, unless if you're keeping a ton of blockers back, you're either like leaving linebackers free to blow up the run, or you're leaving Garrett on a one-on-one, which I don't see any. There's no reason to do that, and I don't think there's any team that would ever really do that. So I think at least while Garrett is still kind of the freak athlete that he is, and they have some other sort of pieces on the defensive line, I think not being able to work through double teams right away is actually not as big of a problem. I think it's definitely something to work on, but not necessarily something that needs to be fixed sort of ASAP. Okay, so then in the third round, they got Zach Zinter. He's a guard out of Michigan. I think he definitely can be a day one starter. He may never become a top 10 guard in the NFL, but he's going to be a serviceable starter. I think it's like the perfect kind of pick at round 3. He's a capable, but not someone who needs to sort of develop before he can play. The offensive line with the Browns has been like great pretty much ever since that Wyatt Teller trade with the Bills. I think that was probably 5 or 6 years ago, I'm guessing. They've been really good, but they do have Joel Bitonio, who's starting to kind of show some cracks in terms of maybe not being quite as athletic and dominant as he's been throughout his whole career. So if I think it'll be good for start Bitonio, obviously give him a chance, but you kind of have this guy in waiting who's gonna develop and fine tune some stuff, learn the scheme and all that. But let's say it's not going super well, make the switch at the bye week, make the switch at one of those sort of when you have like a mini bye week kind of thing, or just make the swap. If he's letting up pressures and sacks, it can't be a ton worse than maybe we'd get from a rookie. Anyway, so we'll kind of see how that works. Another possibility is if I think his name is Pocic at center they brought in. If that doesn't necessarily work out, it could be either Zinter or Bitonio sliding over to center if they have experience doing that. So it could be a potential that they both start. Sort of offers a lot of flexibility. It's going to be an interesting training camp battle to find the best sort of 5 offensive lineman combination. So I'm interested to sort of see how the depth chart sort of lines up as we enter training camp in the preseason. Be interesting to sort of see sort of who makes it with the offensive line for the Browns. In the 5th round, pick 156, they got Jamari Thrash, who's a wide receiver out of Louisville. He's a pretty good route runner. He's quick but not athletic. Doesn't have the top speed and acceleration. He's sort of a smaller statured guy, so he's going to struggle in contested catches, sort of bump and run situations. He might be better off in the slot, as a slot receiver against the team's running zone. I think he might have a hard time getting separation in man, but A lot of teams are going to be running zone, at least some zone concepts with maybe some man built in with that. So because of his small size and athleticism, it's going to limit his opportunities to sort of stay on the field. But if he is sort of placed into the lineup due to injuries, I think he could be a serviceable replacement, even on the outside. Really good value at the fifth round. In a normal sort of wide receiver draft class, he might have been a third or fourth round pick. So grabbing him in the fifth here, I think is really really good. Then in the sixth round, in pick 206, they drafted Nathaniel Watson, who's a linebacker out of Mississippi State. He's a pretty good player who just doesn't have that top level athleticism to be effective in all schemes, but he's going to be better in zones, obviously, sort of allow him to be defending tight ends and running backs rather than quicker players and wide receivers. He's a good depth linebacker who has the potential to start if Jordan Hicks doesn't really mesh well with the Browns' defensive scheme. He was pretty good last year, I think, with the Vikings. Jordan Hicks was, if I remember right. But Hicks, who's a better run defender and blitzing linebacker. Now you have Watson, who's maybe not quite as knowledgeable and obviously maybe instinctual as a veteran linebacker, but he might be a little more athletic and maybe a little better in zone coverages. So I think a little bit will depend on sort of how the Browns want to run their defense. Are they going to be a team that's sort of pressure focused? Are they going to pull back and sort of make sort of teams try to find tight windows and go more for turnovers? That will make a huge difference. I see upside with both Hicks and Watson, and maybe it's matchup dependent. Maybe there's some times where you really want to. There's a lot of weapons, and you have veteran quarterback, a lot of weapons, does well with pressure, all that sort of stuff. Let's throw Watson out there. We got a younger cornerback, doesn't deal with pressure, kind of throws up the ball sometimes. They don't have maybe dynamic underneath weapons. Let's go with Hicks and maybe dial up some more blitz packages. So I think it's nice to have both players because they do different things well. So that's like a big benefit. In the seventh round, they've got 2 7th-round picks. This one's 227. Miles Harden, who was a cornerback out of South Dakota. He's good instincts, but another smaller player. So he's gonna have a hard time keeping up with some of the more athletic players. And he really allows too much separation. He's more of a depth and developmental cornerback with some special teams potential. Probably a better fit as a nickel corner, but he's coming from South Dakota, and so it's just going to be a big jump from South Dakota to the pros. So there's going to be a lot of learning to do. So that's sort of where I see that more as a developmental piece. I think if he's starting as a rookie, that's not good. I think in the end, if he can stick on the roster and develop, or at least stick on the practice squad and develop, I think that will. I think that's sort of the goal for this year. And then maybe he's with the changes in the kickoff and some other kinds of stuff, he might be able to have some benefit being on special teams. But I don't really, of all the 7th-round picks so far, I don't necessarily see being able to roster a player like that. Then the last pick, and this is pick 243, is Jawan Briggs, another D tackle out of Cincinnati. He has good measurables, a lot of size and athleticism, but shorter arms. So it might kind of lower his ceiling, especially being on the inside. It kind of allows offensive linemen to get their hands on him and to affect his ability to sort of make pass rush moves or kind of shed blocks in the run game. So if that kind of stuff can be developed to be effective even with shorter arms, there are other players who aren't the prototypical size and length that you'd get. If he's able to do that, this could really be a steal for the Browns in the 7th round. You could be a good player, a quality player. It could even be a great player if you kind of learn how to be effective, despite sort of the physical traits not necessarily being 100%. So kind of all in all, the Browns draft continues to be limited by the trade for Deshaun Watson. Hall Jr. is going to be probably a rotational player as a rookie and the potential to become a long-term starter if he's able to develop. Zinter is sort of a possible sign that they might be, sort of kind of have to move off Bitonio for, for their O-line. But, as a 3rd-round player, I'm not really expecting him to start right away. Especially, on the Browns, you have to be a very good player to start as a rookie because they just have a great offensive line. probably one of the best in the league. So, his opportunity to start might be more into the second or third year, sort of depending on sort of how that goes. Thrash is an interesting fifth rounder, sort of the undersized guy, as I said, but he with you got Cooper, now you've got Judy, you've got some other kinds of players. I think there's a lot of opportunities here, both for this year, but especially moving forward. So if he's able to stick, if he's able to have a role, sometimes you grow over time, um, and be able to be able to record some stats, something, right? Even if it's even if it's just 200 yards or something in a small amount of playing time, but just showing some promise, I think can go a long way. You know, and again, sort of going back to Watson, I think that of everyone out of this class, partially because of the position and sort of filling needs in free agency and some other kinds of stuff, I actually think Watson is probably going to be the one that has the most potential to actually start this year. I'm not necessarily predicting that he's going to start over Hicks, but I definitely think that there is some value there to see sort of how he learns the scheme and sort of develops. I don't know who wears the green dot with the Browns, but obviously if wearing the green dot, I think maybe leaning more on the veteran is for this year is probably more likely. But if the different teams do it different ways, if the middle linebacker isn't wearing the green dot, then obviously it really increases the chances that that Watson might be able to start at linebacker. So looking at the overall grade, because there's no first round pick, I'm really going to have to give it a C plus. It's really a B draft, but just the lack of getting any top talent in the first, it's really hard to sort of rationalize such a high grade. I think for the picks that they had, considering ideally you give up your first round pick, like you think of the Bills trading Stephon Diggs, and yeah, they could have had Justin Jefferson, but they also got Stephon Diggs. The Browns gave up 3 firsts, and they got maybe a 12th to 15th best quarterback in the league, being very generous. So, just kind of hard to give them a good draft, especially when the return on their investment just hasn't been that good. So, yeah, they just gave up a lot of capital for someone that they thought would be probably when they traded for him, probably thought he would be a top 8 type quarterback. I think GMs, just sort of thinking big picture, I think GMs around the NFL are kind of starting to realize just how bad taking a year off is for players. We've seen this with Le'Veon Bell. We've sort of seen this with I think it's like Tardif, the guy that was the doctor during COVID. There's a lot of players who've just come back and just aren't the same. I think football maybe more so than like basketball and all these other things. It's such a technique driven. It's such a like film study driven. Like I think these players haven't taken time. They haven't taken a year off from football. Some of them since like the 5th grade. So I think they're kind of seeing now that it just doesn't really work when players take that much time off. And it kind of does give teams a lot of leverage with holdouts, which is kind of unfortunate from a player's perspective. I think players obviously would love to just hold out, don't sign that franchise tag, just come back a year later and still be dominant. But unfortunately, it's just not the case. So kind of looking big picture at the division, have the other teams really caught up to the Ravens? Obviously with the Bengals because of the fact that they have Joe Burrow, he might take health out of it. He could even maybe be the best quarterback in the division. So the Bengals are always going to be the best competition for the Ravens. They loaded up on both lines this year. They did add a receiver who I think is going to be a solid replacement for Tyler Boyd, even if not as a rookie. But with the Bengals, the biggest concern I have is tight end and running back, and trying to make get decent contributions from those positions. And then obviously the health of Joe Burrow is always going to be big. For the Steelers, they have a good roster, but it's just that quarterback question. They're trying to kind of not hit the reset button with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields. They want to sort of keep competitive. We all know how Tomlin doesn't like to lose, and he doesn't want a losing record. He doesn't want high draft picks. He's done pretty well drafting in sort of that middle to late-ish first round. They've gotten a lot of really good players even later. So they do have a good roster, but as I said before, they're starting to get on the older side with some of their dominant players. Some of them are getting injured more. They're going to have to make that decision. I think if they're 2-6, they're 3-5, whatever it is, and I know the trade deadline has been pushed back, but they start to see that they kind of look at the remaining schedule and say this is going to be tough. Maybe it's time to blow up the team a little bit. I'm not saying you have to trade away every player who's older than 28 years old, but if you get players who are on the older side of 26, 27 who you can get first round picks for, or it's second rounders at least. I think it might be about that time to do that. So I just don't see the Steelers being super competitive this year because of the quarterback. And then some of the offensive line issues too. I mean, maybe those that they draft will help with that, but it's not the same as having a really quality offensive line like what the Browns have. And then with the Browns, it's always gonna be just issues at quarterback. It's the Chubb injury was pretty bad last year. That was pretty brutal to watch. I was actually watching that game, and it was pretty horrendous. I don't know what he's gonna be like when he comes back. So that's going to make a huge difference. And so it's going to be tough to sort of see, even Watson wasn't able to finish the year last year. I mean, that kind of was the reason why they made the turnaround like they did, was because of the fact that they got off Deshaun Watson. And so, yeah, I think actually the Steelers and the Browns are both in that. We don't really necessarily think our quarterbacks are what we need them to be. So, the Ravens probably, honestly, they didn't even need to draft, and they probably still, to me, would be the odds-on favorite. Bringing people back healthy, getting consistency, from the offensive production, and giving Zay Flowers a chance to grow in the second year. You got Mark Andrews, obviously you got Lamar Jackson. They've got a lot of great players on defense. I would probably still pick them, even without a draft. Now I think they added a lot of really quality players, a mix of here and now and 3 to 4 years down the road. And so assuming there's no injuries, of course that's always hard. Both Burrow and Jackson have had their difficulties with injuries. Assuming that, I think it's the Ravens' division to lose. Obviously, the Bengals will be right there. And, maybe I'll be wrong, and maybe Deshaun Watson and either Russ Wilson or Fields are going to really be quality. Maybe sort of middle of the road. Because all they need is really 12 to 15th best quarterback. That's all the Steelers really need. Is they need one of them to just be a little above average, and that's it. Just be productive. Move the ball, score some points, allow the defense to sort of keep people out. And the problem with last year was that they just didn't have much help at all. So, if they can get more production, then this division might be a little more wide open. But I really see the Ravens winning, and then the Bengals being one of the top wild card spots this year. Obviously, assuming everyone stays healthy in terms of the quarterback. So we'll see. So, all right. Well, I appreciate everyone for sort of sticking with us and going through this this review of sort of the AFC North, kind of looking ahead to the preseason and kind of what we expect from them this year. Consider sort of liking, subscribing. I'm going to keep this going throughout the summer here, so eventually get through all 8 divisions. Next up is going to be the NFC North, and then I believe I'm going to go through the South divisions next, kind of move around a little bit, and then probably finish up with the West divisions because those are some of the more interesting ones, I think. So feel free to like and subscribe, share it with your friends and all that, and we will see you next time.